Hi everyone, my name is Jenny and I'm back today to do another video. Today I'm going to be offering some nonfiction climate change recommendations in honor of Nonfiction November. Climate change is an area of great interest to me, both personally and professionally and academically. All of the different ways that climate change could be interesting to someone. I majored in biology in undergrad, and my primary focus was really on conservation biology and understanding climate change and its role on ecosystems and the impact it'll have on biological systems globally. Additionally, I am also interested in pursuing climate change mitigation adaptation work post-graduate school, so it's really an area of great interest to me, as I assume it should be for everyone, and so I felt it only appropriate that I do a nonfiction November recommendation video about some climate change books that I have read and really enjoyed, but also some that I am looking forward to reading in the near future. I also have organized this given that everyone's on a different stage of their climate change learning knowledge journey in different sections. So I have some books that are great to start with if you really don't know much at all about climate change that I would say are approachable even for someone without a science background, all the way to books that really dig into the science or are about a really specific issue within climate change. I will also say that since my background is in biology and I am interested in pursuing like human ecology, transportation, community development work, my focuses on climate change primarily are like in biological, anthropological, and political realms, and less so on the kind of geological, meteorological side of things, but I am interested in some of those topics, and definitely some of the books that I'll be talking about feature a lot of those kind of changes and outcomes as well. One final caveat that I will mention is that I'm using the words climate change in large part because climate change kind of encompasses and will affect a global geopolitical reach into almost every issue that we're facing today as a global society. However, some of these books touch a bit more on larger issues of environmental change, and often the two kind of in the public sphere are sometimes conflated in terms of biodiversity loss as being connected to climate change, which is true. Climate change is definitely impacting biodiversity loss. Additionally, kind of general human activities that are unsustainable are also impacting biodiversity loss potentially more than climate change itself. So some of the books that I'm going to talk about here really are more about global greater environmental changes and less so about climate change specifically, although climate change is mentioned, but climate change is a useful way of thinking about kind of greater environmental change more broadly. So I just wanted to point that out as well, that this is in large part more of a kind of greater environmental change recommendation, although it's primarily climate change focused. So without further ado, let's just get into the recommendations. So to start off, I'm going to have two books that are great kind of starting points. The first of which was actually a starting point for me in my undergrad degree, which was The Sixth Extinction by Elizabeth Kolbert. So this is a perfect example of what I was just talking about, of climate change being used as a means to understand greater environmental change, which is definitely true in Kolbert's work. While Kolbert talks about climate change quite a bit, this is primarily focused on biodiversity loss and the impacts of biodiversity loss on our kind of global ecological system. So this is a really phenomenal work. Kolbert is a writer for The New Yorker, and she'll actually come up later in this video. And I think her work is really approachable even for someone without a science background. This was traditionally published by Picador, which is a trade publishing house, and most of the books in this list are actually published by trade publishers and not by like academic presses. I would recommend this book as a good place to start to kind of understand where we are and where we are going in terms of biodiversity loss and climate change's impacts on that biodiversity loss. I will say this book was published in 2014, which doesn't seem that long ago, but in the scale of scientific research, this is a slightly dated version probably. And so a lot of the kind of statistics and numbers in here are not going to be as accurate, but at least this will help you get the information you need to look up the most recent numbers, such as, you know, the global output of CO2 is probably mentioned as like under 400 parts per million, and it's now over 400 parts per million. So that type of thing is probably no longer accurate with this book, but the general ideas are still there. Then the next one is one that I actually read earlier this year during the Springathon, so I'll put a link up to where I talked about this one in my Springathon vlog, but this is The Story of More, How We Got to Climate Change and Where to Go From Here by Hope Jaron. Hope Jaron is a geologist, paleobotanist, who studies ecological systems of the past and is now getting more and more interested in climate change research. I believe she's now based in Norway and she does climate change research there. And this is a great primer on the history of our Earth's climate, as well as the current trends in climate and kind of what outcomes that may have. This, I think, would be really great for someone who has very little background in science, as Hope Jaron writes really clearly and just is a fantastic science writer in general. And I really enjoyed this one. I do think, and this is potentially less true of the Sixth Extinction, that if you are somewhat familiar with climate change, this is probably not going to be as useful for you anymore. In fact, I don't really think I learned anything from this myself, but then again, I spent a lot of my undergrad degree like thinking and talking about climate change, so obviously reading a book that's a primer is not going to be the most helpful. But if you are at kind of base 1, then this is a great place to start. Then moving into 2 books that really dig into the science. So if you are kind of past the primers, have some understanding and want science to really dig into, I think both of these books would be great for that. The first of which is Plows, Plagues, and Petroleum by William Readyman. Readyman is a geologist, I believe, and this was published by Princeton Press, so it is an academic text, and it has a lot of graphs and figures and such, so be prepared for that going into this one. This one is surprisingly readable, and in this, Readyman makes the argument that the agricultural revolution 10,000 years ago is actually really where we should be thinking about the ways that humans began impacting negatively our Earth's climate. So super interesting one. I remember this being pretty engaging. I read it when I was a freshman in undergrad and I understood it for the most part. So I would recommend this one. Definitely super interesting and lots of great figures which are useful as well. This one is also slightly dated. It was published in 2010, but it is also more of a geological look at climate and less so about the present day, and so it's fairly accurate still in terms of the facts and figures that this provides. Then moving into our next book that is probably even more dense and difficult to get into, we have Climate and Ecosystems by Dave Schmill. This is quite a chunker. It's also published by Princeton Press, and it is dense as can be. I read this for the first time when I was a sophomore in undergrad, and honestly probably only understood about 40% of what he was saying. I've not read it since then. I skimmed it when I was a teaching assistant for that class that I read this for, and I understood more of it, obviously, but definitely did not understand all of it even then, I don't think. But it is a really useful look at the overview of the literature on climate change and its impact on ecological systems. Again, this one is slightly dated. It was published in 2013, so there's definitely been a lot more research in this topic since then, but this is a great kind of overview of a lot of those topics. So yeah, would recommend this one as well, but just be warned that this is very much an academic text, and it's written for scientists, and scientists are notoriously exclusive with how they like to write and think, and it is not a place where someone who is not familiar with the scientific jargon is going to be able to easily pick up what is being said. So tread with caution in this one, but it is a really fascinating look if climate change impacts on the natural world and ecological systems is something you are interested in learning more about. Then the next one is kind of bridging the gap between really academic heavy texts and history. So in my undergrad, I also took an upper level history class wherein we discussed the ideas of wilderness in America, and I wrote a term paper on climate change communication for the National Park Service, looking specifically at the lens of Grand Canyon National Park, which is undergoing rapid climate change as the rest of the world is, obviously, and kind of how is that being communicated to visitors of the park. And in researching that paper, I came across this book, Making Climate Change History, Documents from Global Warming's Past, which was edited by Joshua P. Howe, and this was put out by the University of Washington Press. So again, another academic text, and Howe is a historian, and he contextualizes a lot of the primary documents that this work is a compilation of really nicely and effectively in understanding how we got to where we are politically in terms of discussing climate change. So I'd recommend this one if you want to go to some primary source material, like for example James Hansen's presentation and hearing in front of the Senate in 1989 is published in this work. So it's a helpful book if you're interested in learning about the specifics of climate change in politics, particularly in America, if I'm remembering correctly. I don't think other countries were discussed all that much, except for potentially the international Paris Accord Kyoto Protocol, etc. So those types of things, I believe, were discussed in this. I have now read this several years ago, and I don't have a copy. I got it from the library at the time that I was doing that term paper, but it was a really useful source, and I definitely think would be useful if you want to kind of get into the primary source material. However, if you were looking for someone to have done that for you, I would highly recommend Losing Earth, A Recent History by Nathaniel Rich. Rich is a journalist. He's a contributor to The Atlantic primarily, and this is a phenomenal piece of narrative nonfiction, and this was pulled from a very long New York Times article that was expanded into this work, and I believe the turnaround on that was like only a couple months or something. It was very quick that he kind of pulled this together to be published, and this basically tells the story of how climate change was discovered to be a problem that's being caused by humans in the United States by oil companies, and how those oil companies alongside the US government basically tried to cover that up through marketing and political schemes. So this book is incredibly frustrating, incredibly depressing, but super fascinating in terms of understanding why climate change has been politicized so much in the United States and thereby globally, and therefore kind of stalling all action on climate change is primarily because of things discussed in this book. So would highly recommend this one, and it's short too. You'll get through it in an afternoon or so. And it's well written, it's pretty easily accessible. This could also be a great starting point if you wanted to get a like historical scope of what's happened in terms of like climate change policy and action in the United States. But then again, this one, if you don't really know anything about climate change, you probably wouldn't understand some of the discussions in this book. But yeah, overall, I would highly recommend this one. Now moving on to a couple books that discuss specific issues within the kind of larger scheme of climate change, or are focused in particular region and the outcomes that it may see in terms of climate change. So the first of which is the book that I've read the most recently, which is The Fragile Earth, Writings from the New Yorker on Climate Change. And this is a compilation of writings from the New Yorker starting in 1989 with Bill McKibben's The End of Nature and moving all the way to late 2019. And this one really covers pretty much all of the major issues surrounding climate change, which include the issues of continued offshore drilling in the Arctic, global destabilization due to desertification, issues of solar electrification. Really everything in terms of problems and proposed solutions is covered in this text. So it would be also a great place to start if you were interested in kind of understanding how climate change is impacting different sectors of the economy and different sectors of our culture globally. That I think this one would be a really valuable text to use for that. Much of the issues in here are ones that if you're super familiar with climate change, you may be already kind of informed about, but there were even some interesting articles for me as someone who knows a fair amount about the topic in terms of global destabilization regarding climate change. Particularly, there was a fascinating article about the Lake Chad region of West Africa and how that is rapidly destabilizing in large part due to major droughts caused by climate change. So there's some very fascinating articles in here about a wide berth of topics. So while this really covers all of the issues, each article is about a specific issue that I think would be beneficial to anyone wanting to learn more about climate change. Then a book that focuses its attention regionally, we have The Death and Life of the Great Lakes by Dan Egan. Egan is a journalist out of Milwaukee, and this is a book basically about greater environmental change in the Great Lakes region, primarily in the Great Lakes themselves, although he does expand his scope slightly. And this one majorly touches on climate change, but it also touches on issues of invasive species and biodiversity loss, and how those issues will impact the urban centers that rely on the Great Lakes, both for trade purposes, but also for water. So this is a super fascinating book about the Great Lakes region specifically, that I think if you're interested in this region or interested in water policy and kind of issues with water, then this one would be super engaging for you to read. Then on a related note, another one that ties even more closely to issues of water rights, we have Where the Water Goes, Life and Death Along the Colorado River by David Owen, who actually is featured in The Fragile Earth. He has an essay on green urbanism that is not at all relevant to this book, but he has a different book about green urbanism, but this one is about the Colorado River, as the subtitle suggests, and the growing environmental changes that the Colorado River is experiencing that are being exacerbated by the strain in terms of how many people rely on the Colorado River as their primary source of water. So the Colorado River is a great case study, I think, for understanding issues of climate change if you are interested in an American Western lens of understanding climate change, because it is something that's going to directly impact millions of people, but is also rapidly experiencing change. So yeah, I really enjoyed this one. It also does have a historical bent to it and discusses some issues not directly related to climate change, but overall would still definitely recommend this one if water issues and geopolitical issues and the relationship between those things and climate change is something that interests you. Then finally, the last book that's about a specific issue is whales. So we have Spying on Whales, The Past, Present, and Future of Earth's Most Awesome Creatures by Nick Penionson. Penionson is a paleontologist at the Smithsonian. He is the curator of the fossil marine mammals. Would love to have that job at the Smithsonian's Institute National Museum of Natural History in DC. This is basically a book all about whales, how they first evolved, what's happening to them right now, and what might happen to them in the future in terms of their evolution. And he does significantly touch on climate change, but also humans' involvement and changes to whales' ecology more broadly, kind of both in the recent past but also in the present day. So super engaging one as well. And while climate change is obviously not the focus here, climate change definitely comes up. And I would say that's also just generally true of kind of nature writing and books about science and animals that are published today, is that pretty much every author is going to mention climate change in some way, because that's kind of the primary issue that is facing every natural thing in the entire world. So definitely any book that has some kind of animal aspect that's primarily focused on the animal and less so potentially a like memoir slash animal ecological account will probably have some like climate change related topics in it. So this one is also a great one that I believe I even recommended in my Springathon recommendations video, which also had some climate change recommendations in it as well, that I really enjoyed and would highly recommend. Now moving into a slightly cheerier aspect of climate change, which is climate change solutions, adaptations, mitigation surrounding climate change. So the first of which that I have to recommend is Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teachings of Plants by Robin Wall Kimmerer. I actually recently saw her at a virtual talk that was just phenomenal, and it was actually more climate change focused than this book necessarily is, in large part because this book was published several years ago. It was published back in 2013 by Milkweed Editions, which is a phenomenal independent press out of Minneapolis. And actually there's a recent, I believe a like updated edition of this book coming out from Milkweed that may touch on climate change more directly. I'm not entirely sure because I don't have that edition obviously, but I think this one could be used to understand how indigenous knowledge both within the United States but also globally can be used as a way to mitigate and adapt to some of the issues we face because of climate change. And I think Kimmerer establishes the importance of using indigenous knowledge in our Western's understandings of ecology and science more broadly really well in this book. So yeah, overall I would highly recommend it. It does have some personal things in there as well, so if memoir is your cup of tea, would highly recommend this as well. Overall, just one of my favorite nonfiction books of all time, and definitely one that is super relevant to understanding and thinking about solutions regarding climate change. Then the other like solutions-based climate change book that I want to recommend, put a link to where I reviewed it up in the cards above. It's The Future Earth, A Radical Vision for What's Possible in the Age of Warming by Eric Holthaus. And this one I really enjoyed. While it is a little too optimistic apparently and a little too driven by basically dissolving capitalism and establishing socialism, which may or may not be a realistic way to mitigate and adapt to climate change, it's a wonderful thought exercise of like what is possible given the different technologies that we have available to us right now. So I would still recommend this one if you're just looking for like a happy way to think about how climate change mitigation and adaptation might be possible if you're in kind of the depths of despair about like we're all gonna die because of climate change. This one's a nice one to think like, oh wait, these are actually possible solutions that we could implement because we have the technology if we send the funds needed to those aspects of the economy. So I think this one is helpful if you are looking for ways to potentially send your dollars towards initiatives that are benefiting climate change mitigation or that are involved in creating regenerative economies. This might help you in kind of taking steps towards action with regards to climate change. And this book also heavily ties together the reality that climate change is not only an environmental issue, but an issue of social equity, and that climate change mitigation and adaptation needs to involve social equity and anti-racism to be successful. So really appreciated that aspect of this book as well. Would recommend it if you're looking for a cheerier book on climate change. So those are all my recommendations, but I also wanted to quickly go over some of the books that I'm looking forward to in terms of climate change nonfiction. I'm not sure if I'll be able to get to any of these during Nonfiction November this year, but I definitely want to get to them in the near future. So to start off, the only one that I have a physical copy of is one that I'm super excited about and definitely hoping to get to sooner rather than later, which is All We Can Save: Truth, Courage, and Solutions for the Climate Crisis, edited by Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson and Catherine K. Wilkinson. This one just came out this past month and is a collective work of different activists, policymakers, scientists, poets, artists, probably every different type of journalists, farmers, teachers, innovators. All sorts of people are featured in here, primarily women who are doing work to actually solve issues surrounding climate change. So I'm super excited about this one. It is beautifully published by One World. I am just like truly obsessed with how wonderfully published this book is. Like, look at that. It's beautiful. And I'm definitely looking forward to getting to this one very, very soon. So this one probably is actually one that I'll get to during Nonfiction November just because I'm so excited about it, but definitely one to keep on your radar if you are looking for more solutions-based work in terms of climate change. Then the next 5 are all ones that I don't have a copy of, but I'm super excited to get to. The first of which is In Search of the Canary Tree: The Story of a Scientist, a Cypress, and a Changing World by Lauren Oakes. Lauren Oakes is an ecologist, and this is a memoir slash, I think, kind of nature writing, science exploration of her PhD work about a tree in Alaska that is going extinct, it sounds like, because of climate change. So I'm super excited about this one. I've been wanting to read it for ages and ages. I think Olive read this one several years ago and really enjoyed it, and that's probably where I heard about it, and this is definitely one that I want to get to sooner rather than later. The next one is another edited work like All We Can Save, which is Tale of Two Planets: Stories of Climate Change and Inequality in a Divided World. Again, I think this one is primarily focused on understanding and discussing how climate change is a social equity issue. Super excited about this one. It's an edited work. The editor of this is John Freeman, and this one actually came out earlier this year, so it's a more recent book on climate change. Second to last, we have another Milkweed Editions book, which is Rising: Dispatches from the New American Shore. This one won a prestigious prize, and now I can't remember what prestigious prize it was, but this is by Elizabeth Rush, and as it says on the subtitle, is about different urban centers that are located along the coast in the United States and what they're doing in terms of climate change mitigation and adaptation. Super excited about this one. Again, I keep saying this for every book, but I want to get to this one sooner rather than later. I totally forgot one of the books that I was planning on talking about in this little TBR section, which is A Furious Sky: The 500-Year History of America's Hurricanes by Eric J. Dolan, as I believe how you'd say his last name. And I'm not sure if it's because it's hurricane season right now, or because I've been thinking more about the role of urban planning in like climate mitigation and adaptation, but hurricanes have been really fascinating and of interest to me of late, so I'm super excited about this one. I definitely want to read it soon. I believe, as it says on the tin, it's a like cultural and geological slash meteorological history of America's hurricanes and kind of what impacts they've had on American society at large. And I think also my interest in hurricanes, in addition to it being hurricane season, is in part due to Southerly Magazine, which is an online magazine that focuses on publishing stories of the underrepresented South pretty much. And I will definitely put a link to them down in the description box below. I would highly recommend if kind of Southern stories is something of interest to you. But they've been doing a lot of reporting on like Gulf Coast lives that have been impacted not only by COVID-19, but also by hurricanes that have been really fascinating and thought-provoking. So I think that has also added to my interest in hurricanes quite a bit. So I will put a link to their online magazine down below. All of their articles are free, but you can become a member, which I recently have just because I want to kind of support them. And I believe it's a women I don't think there's any men on their staff. I definitely know the editor-in-chief is a woman named Lindsay because she sends weekly emails that I would also recommend checking out. So super excited about this one. He apparently is a pretty well-known author. I think I've heard of one other book by him and I'm excited about it. But yeah, I just wanted to kind of pop in here and mention this one as well, since this is another one that I'm super excited about. Then finally, the last one doesn't actually come out until next April 2021, but it's Overheated: How Capitalism Broke the Planet and How We Fight Back by Kate Aronoff. This one sounds super fascinating. It's out by Bold Type Books, and it is basically about the relationship between climate change and capitalism. Super intrigued about it. Would love to read it someday. So that is going to be everything for today. If you found me through this video, I'd love to have you stick around and subscribe. I do talk about climate change nonfiction, but I also talk about a lot of other different things, including other types of nonfiction, which, speaking of, if you're interested in a nonfiction recommendations about like sustainable living more broadly and not necessarily about like climate change or environmental change, do let me know, because I have quite a few recommendations about sustainable living and different aspects of your life. So that is something that I definitely could do. Additionally, if you found my channel through this video, I'd love to have you stick around and subscribe. I hope you're having a great rest of your day whenever you're watching this, and I will talk to you next time.